Professor Allan Lichtman, known as Nostradamus when it comes to US elections. What's your prediction this year round?
Now my system predicts Kamala Harris will break through the glass ceiling and become the first woman president of the United States. And Donald Trump is a great showman. He only appeals to a narrow base. His average approval rating as a president was 41%, one of the lowest in history. Since remember, they all called Hillary Clinton in 2016 when I was virtually alone in calling Donald Trump.
I'm being joined by Professor Allan Lichtman, known as Nostradamus when it comes to US elections and the predictions. He has been predicting since 1984, has almost never got it wrong. Professor Lichtman, thank you so much for joining us over here. What's your prediction this year round? You got Biden correct, Trump correct, Obama correct, and many other presidents. So what's it this time? Who are you calling this time?
I am making a prediction based upon my system, the keys to the White House, which you noted has been right since I predicted Ronald Reagan's re-election in April 1982, nearly 3 years ahead of time, during what was then the worst recession since the Great Depression, when his approval ratings were down in the dumps. Now my system predicts that we are going to have a path-breaking result in 2024, that Kamala Harris will break through the glass ceiling and become the first woman president of the United States. That's where the keys stand now.
So you're calling Kamala Harris. That's a big one. We'll be asking you of all the 13 key indicators that you explain as to why. But you defy all the pollsters and pundits. There are many who are putting Trump ahead, many who are saying it's going to be a tough fight. What made you predict that this is going to be Kamala Harris's election?
Yes, the keys to the White House are unique. They ignore the pundits who have no scientific basis for their predictions. Remember, they all called Hillary Clinton in 2016 when I was virtually alone in calling Donald Trump. It doesn't pay attention to the polls, which are snapshots, not predictors, and they were also wrong in 2016. The keys to the White House are different in that they tap into how American presidential elections really work as votes up or down on the strength and performance of the White House party. And that's what the keys gauge. And it's a simple decision rule. If 6 or more of the 13 keys go against the White House party, now the Democrats, they are predicted losers. Fewer than 6, they are predicted winners. I've now called the keys and found that Kamala Harris at most has lost 4 to 5 keys. There's a little bit shaky calls on foreign policy because there are still 2 wars raging. But regardless, she falls short of the 6 negative keys that would be needed to predict that Donald Trump would return to the White House and Harris would lose. Instead, the keys are now pointing to her victory.
Well, that's very interesting. Let's go through your keys. You have 13 keys, 2 of which also talk about charisma. But let's go one by one. Explain to us the keys and how they work for you in your reading of who will win.
Yes. Keep in mind it takes 6 keys to count her out. Key number 1 is the mandate key based on U.S. House elections. That key is false because Democrats lost seats in 2022. Second key is the internal party contest for the White House party. And despite the switch from Biden, which I thought would lead to a big party brawl, Democrats suddenly grew a spine and got smart, united behind Harris. That key is true. Key number 3 is incumbency, obviously false once Biden stepped down. Key number 4 is third party, and the candidacy of RFK Jr. has fizzled. He suspended his campaign, and that may in part have been due to the switch to Harris, since no longer did the American voters have to choose between 2 old white guys. Hate to say that, being a white guy myself, but that's the way it goes. So of the first 4, 2 are false. Remember, it takes 6.
Yes.
Next is the recession key, that there is no recession in the election year. There's no recession. There's not going to be one in 2 months. That key is true. Key number 6 is the long-term economic key measured by real per capita growth in the term, 2 terms, and the Biden growth is more than double. That key is true. Key number 7 is policy change. Huge policy changes from Trump to Biden on the environment, on immigration, on infrastructure, on taxes, inflation, climate change. That key is true. Key number 8 is social unrest. Now, there has been some sporadic social unrest, but we've seen it largely fizzle. Nothing much happened at the Democratic convention. To turn this key, there has to be massive, sustained social unrest. Nothing like that. That key is true. Then we come to my favorite key, the scandal key, number 8. And Republicans have been trying to pin a scandal on Biden for 4 years. They've come up empty. Their star witness, Mr. Smirnov, was arrested by the FBI for lying about Biden and spreading Russian propaganda. And according to the key, and you've got to stick to my definitions, it has to implicate himself. It can't be Hunter Biden or a family member. So that key is true. Then we have the most difficult keys, the 2 foreign policy keys, because we still have 2 wars raging. Number 10 is foreign policy. Failure, did they avoid it? And I think right now Gaza has been a big failure, a humanitarian disaster with no end in sight. Foreign policy success, another tough key, but I've split the keys. I've called that for Biden because it was Biden and Biden alone who put together the coalition of the West that stopped Putin from quickly conquering Ukraine and then threatening America's NATO allies. And with continuing support from Biden, Ukraine has survived for more than 2.5 years and even made an incursion into Russian territory. I think this will go down as a great accomplishment of American diplomacy, so that key is true. Key number 12, incumbent charisma, a very high threshold key. To win this key, the incumbent candidate has to be one of those once-in-a-generation, transformational candidates that appeals across the board, like Franklin Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan. Whatever you may think of Harris, she doesn't fit that. That's false. That's 4 false keys. Last one, that the challenging candidate is not one of these once-in-a-generational transformation of candidates. And Donald Trump is a great showman, but he doesn't fit the definition of the key because he only appeals to a narrow base. His average approval rating as a president was 41%, one of the lowest in history. He lost 2 consecutive presidential elections in the popular vote by a combined 10 million votes. So that key is true. So that's 4 keys down, possibly, conceivably a 5th, depending on what happens in the wars. But no matter what, there aren't enough keys to elect Donald Trump and count out Harris. That's why I'm predicting a woman president in 2024.
Well, that's great news. First woman president, first of South Asian and African American origin, or first Indian and Black woman president.
That's extraordinary. A woman of color, both East Indian and African American Black. And Donald Trump, of course, has totally blown that, saying, "Oh, she suddenly turned Black." What nonsense! She went to a historically Black university. She joined a Black sorority. She was a member of the Black Caucus in the Senate. Just a lie.
Well, that brings me to the bigger question over here this time around, and which we'd seen last time around as well, Professor Lichtman, is the one of the key factors, which I don't see over here, but you might want to answer, is misinformation, the misinformation, disinformation campaign. How does that really work into this entire indicators that you've spelled out? Is that a factor that you've looked into? Have you factored that in?
I don't. My favorite comedian was the late, great Gilda Radner, who had a character called Rosanna Dana, who said, there's always something unique in an election. In 2008, people said, you got to change your keys because we have an African American running. Never had that before. The country is ready for that. We had massive information in 2016. We've always had misinformation and all kinds of unique things going on in a presidential election. That's why the keys are the North Star prediction. They don't change depending upon these shifting events of the campaign. Now, that said, I'm not, Speaker Mike Johnson, who claims the Almighty talks to him. My keys are based on history, and they're very robust retrospectively in development. They go all the way back to the horse and buggy days of politics in 1860. But could there be some catastrophic, unprecedented change that break the pattern of history? Of course, I'm not so arrogant to say that can't happen, but the point is you never know whether that's going to happen until afterwards. That's why I stick to the keys and don't get distracted by the events of the campaign. And the big positive message of the keys, it's governing, not campaigning, that counts.
Okay, then you're keeping misinformation aside, but when it comes to, it's a unique situation, Professor Lichtman. You have very rarely come across such a situation where where the incumbent has stepped away from the elections and you have another candidate in the fray. In such a scenario, when you are looking at these indicators, do you attribute the trues and false to the incumbent or the candidate? Because the candidate is part of the administration.
The keys are always measured against the strength and performance of the incumbent party, whether the candidate is the sitting president or not. That's the big message of the keys, that elections are based on the strength and performance of the White House party, not on the debates, the fundraising, the ads, the negative tricks. Based on conventional analysis of the campaign, Hillary Clinton should have won going away in 2016. She won all the debates. She had more fundraising, more ads, a better organization, more experience. But I was virtually alone using the keys in predicting a Donald Trump victory.
Why was that? Was that not also because of the baggage of being a part of the administration, which maybe Kamala Harris also carries?
Well, it's different.
I only say this because your indicators on war, your indicators on economy, and on those counts, you would have people looking at performance of the Biden administration as they did the Obama administration.
It's not the Obama administration. Another message of the keys is it works administration by administration. So the Obama first term, there were enough keys in favor of the Democrats to predict Obama's reelection in a very article election that actually called in 2010. Sometimes the keys fall into place early. So we're now judging against the current administration, not the Obama administration. And remember, not only did you have an open seat with Obama not running, you had this major party contest between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, which we don't see today. We also did not see Biden follow up the Affordable Care Act of the first term with any major policy change in the second term. Another difference between the situation today when we've had big changes between Trump and Biden. So you can't compare the two elections.
Okay, a few personal questions, then maybe I'll go back to the predictions. How did you start? What made you think that these could be the key indicators? Have the key indicators ever changed or increased in number all through the years when you've been predicting elections?
Well, I developed the keys by becoming, with my friend Volodya Kailas-Borak of Moscow, the world's leading authority in earthquake prediction, by becoming the odd couple of political prediction. And we reconceptualized presidential elections in 1981, not as Carter versus Reagan, Republican versus Democrat, liberal versus conservative, but in geophysical terms as stability, the White House party stays in power, and earthquake, the White House party is tossed out. And using that conceptualization, we looked at every presidential election from the election of Lincoln in 1860 to the election of Reagan in 1980. This is 81. And we used Kailas-Borak's method of pattern recognition to see what patterns were associated with stability and earthquake. And that led to the development of the 13 keys, which were successful retrospectively from 1860 to 1980. They've now been successful since 1984, and I have not changed a single key.
And you've not increased. It's been 13 ever since.
It's still 13. As I said, they are the constant northern star of prediction.
When you first did it, were you nervous? Were you nervous you'd get it right or wrong? Or you got nervous a little later when you built a reputation and then being wrong would cost you more? When did the nervousness come in? Was it the first time around or much later?
I couldn't tell you how nervous I was when I called Ronald Reagan against all the conventional wisdom in April of 1982. It was my first prediction. If I was wrong in my first prediction, I'd go into the dustbin of political predictors. And of course, now on my 11th prediction in, a very tense election. So of course, I'm nervous. I've been nervous every time because I actually tell you who's going to win or lose. So it's easy to know if I'm right or wrong. I'm not like the clerk, Nate Silver, who compiles polls and tells you Hillary Clinton has maybe a 75% chance of winning. And then when she loses, he says, still, I told you she had a 25% chance of losing. Useless stuff, but I can be right or wrong. And I'm still, at age 77, have butterflies in my stomach. And the other thing is, of course, every 4 years, I make half the country really years. I have the whole country really mad at me. But keep in mind, these are nonpartisan predictions. They're not endorsements. I've predicted about as many Republican as Democratic wins. I've not only predicted, liberals like Barack Obama, but also conservatives like Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump.
But yours is black or white, true or false. That's it. There is no gray area. There is no Nate Silver predictions happening on your turf.
I don't hedge my predictions. That's right. I make calls, and every day I get emails from people who claim they know better how to call the keys. And my answer is simple. You can be free to develop your own prediction system. I encourage you to do that. But if you're going to call the keys, you've got to call them according to how the system defines the keys and how the keys have been called since 1860. I also get, some academics and journalists criticizing me. And my answer is, look at my record. You can't make up a 40-year record. Plus, show me where you've done successful predictions. And none of them have, of course. So I quote the great philosopher Wittgenstein and say, of that which thou canst not speak, let thou remain silent.
Okay. When you started off, and you were getting your predictions right, who would you first call or share this entire victory with? And who do you do it with now?
I share my predictions very broadly. And when I first came up with my system and began predicting, I got blasted by the professional forecasters because they claimed I committed the cardinal sin of subjectivity. My indicators were not cut and dry, and I explained, no. These are judgmental indicators. They're very carefully defined, and they've been answered for well over 100 years. It took about 15 to 20 years, and then the professional forecasting community totally turned around, and they realized their big, fancy, purely statistical models didn't work, and the best model was one like mine that combined statistical and judgmental indicators, and suddenly the keys to the White House were the hottest thing in prediction. I twice was the keynote speaker at the International Forecasting Summit.
All right, Professor Lichtman, do you get reactions from both sides? You already must have got for the prediction that you've made. What's the harshest comment that you've heard so far since yesterday?
I always get reactions to my predictions. And of course, if I predict a Democrat, people say you're biased towards the Democrats. If I picked a Republican, people say you're biased towards the Republicans. And of course, as I've explained, they're purely predictions, not endorsements, have nothing to do with my personal views. In fact, I'll give you the secret of forecasting. It's not knowing math, although you got no math. It's not knowing history, although you got no history. It's not knowing politics, although you got no politics. It's keeping your own personal views out of it. You'd be useless as a forecast. You'd be wrong half the time if you forecasted according to your personal views. But I have to say, since I've made my prediction, I've gotten some criticism, but overwhelmingly, the response has been respectful and positive, realizing I'm not just talking off the top of my head. I have a system that's based on how elections work, and I have an unsurpassed track record.
But do you remember of a harsh comment that you must have read or seen or heard of since your prediction of Kamala Harris?
I didn't catch that.
I said, do you remember of harsh comments that you must have seen, read after your prediction on Kamala Harris's bid?
I got some harsh comments, but much fewer than I thought. But here's the thing. If you want to be a public scholar and contribute to public debate, the worst thing you can get is not criticism. The worst thing you can get is to be ignored. So I much prefer getting criticism to being ignored. Of course, since I go against all the conventional wisdom, the pundits, the pollsters, most political science models, I am going to get criticism. But I have to tell you, over 40 years, I've heard nothing new. It's the same stuff I've been hearing for 40 years, and my record speaks for itself.
Nothing new. The Republicans are much harsher this time around than they ever have been in the past. But going back to the indicators, now you say that you come up with the true or false to each of the 13 indicators, Professor Lichtman. How do you arrive at a true or false? Is it through people? Do you speak? Is it what's the data for this?
Yeah, very simply, it's an empirical result. It's not something I just made up. And we did it in 1981 with my collaborator Kailas Borak, and empirically, we looked at every election from 1860 to 1980. We had one so-called vector, one column with wins and loses, and another column with a whole set of different kinds of questions, not just the 13. And using pattern recognition, we discovered that the best set of yes-no questions that could distinguish between stability and earthquake in 120 years of politics were these 13 keys and the 6th key and you're out decision rule. So this was something we discovered through research, not something we just concocted off the top of our heads. If we had done that, we would have been, wrong a lot of times.
Interesting. So empirical data, but not polling data, not speaking to people and arriving at a decision on a true or false on any indicator.
That's right, because polls are snapshots. They're not predictors. And the error margin of polls is much greater than the pollsters would tell you. They tell you it's plus and minus 3% approximately. That's pure statistical error. That doesn't take into account all the other errors of people not responding, people lying, people not having focus on the election and changing their minds. And of course, they don't know who's voting, so they have to guess at the likely voters. So the error margin of polls is much greater than plus and minus 3%. And it's not random, it's unidirectional. So the polls underestimated Republican voting strength in 2016, but based on recent elections, they're underestimating Democratic voting strength. The big marquee special election in 2024 was the New York congressional election for the seat once held by the disgraced George Santos. A poll taken on the eve of the election had the Democrat ahead by 1 point. He won by 8 points, outperforming the polls by 7 points. So that's why I differ from most other predictors and don't rely on polls, don't rely on talking to people, since, as I said, they can change their minds. Who knows what they're going to tell you? You can't talk to enough people to get any reliable results. So I look at the fundamentals of how elections really work, and I'm really unique in that regard. And
once you predicted, you do not change through the course of the campaign. It stays. This is who you've called. It stays till the very end, till the 5th of November this time.
Correct. Once I make my final prediction, I haven't changed it. And sometimes I make my predictions very, very early. You never know when the keys will fall into place. They fell into place late this time. But for example, in the hard to call 2012 Obama versus Romney election, where a lot of pundits and pollsters got it wrong, I called the keys in 2010 because I could already see them falling in place for Obama's reelection.
So, Professor Lichtman, what happened in 2000 then? Were the indicators not in place when you predicted Al Gore, but George W. Bush won?
It was a very tight election, the keys pointing to Gore. Now, when I was on the Bill Maher show, the first thing he asked me was, how did you F up 2000? Even if I missed that, it's still 9 out of 10, but I didn't. I didn't mess up. Florida did. Bush, 537 votes out of 6 million. But as I proved in my report to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, which is still on their website, Florida screwed up based on the intent of the voters. Al Gore should have won Florida going away and won the presidency, and that was confirmed by an independent study several years later by Professor Walter Mebane of Cornell University.
Okay, final two questions to you. What do you mean by Florida screwed up over here? Like, what was the mistake? Did they call it wrong, or are you saying the people voted wrong?
What happened in Florida in 2000 was they threw out 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 9 votes cast by African Americans who were 90% plus Gore. That compared to 1 out of 50 discarded ballots for whites. So if the discarded ballots for African Americans had been just equal to that of whites, Gore would have won by tens of thousands of votes. Moreover, most of those discarded African American votes were not those hanging chads or dimples, but were overvotes, where they punched in Gore, and to make sure they wrote in Gore, so their intent was clear, but Florida threw them out.
Okay, and finally, before I let you go, you are in this competitive world. You are looking at U.S. presidential elections, but you also, in your personal capacity, have competed this time around in the Olympics, if I'm not wrong. What was all that about?
Yes, way back when, in the submasters division, I was North American champion in the 3,000-meter steeplechase, a race designed for horses but run by people. I don't run that anymore, but I did compete. I'm age 77, so I competed in the 75 to 79 age group in the 800-meter dash and the 1,500-meter dash in the Maryland Senior Olympics. And I won a bronze medal in the 1,500 and a gold medal in the 1,800, which has qualified me to compete next July at Des Moines, Iowa, in the National Senior Olympics, presuming that my body holds up at my age.
That's lovely to hear. Professor Lichtman, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global. This is a massive exclusive. You are actually telling us and predicting the elections here. We will come back to you to see what the elections are going to really throw up and ask you whether if you've got it right or wrong, depending on the results. But thank you so much for sharing the indicators on which your predictions are based. Thank you.
My pleasure, and you know where to find me. Take care.
Take care.